It was a Sunday morning, specifically Palm Sunday, the kind of morning that made folks in the Oklahoma Panhandle feel, for just a fleeting moment, like maybe God hadn't completely overlooked them after all. The sky was crystal clear. The air was perfectly still. The temperature already hit 80 degrees before noon. After 4 years of pure drought, after 4 years of choking dust smothering the fields, and killing off the cattle, and filling children's lungs with what doctors would later diagnose as dust pneumonia, people finally ventured outside. In Guymon, Oklahoma, entire families crowded into the Methodist church for a special prayer service. The minister stepped up to the pulpit and announced, "Good rains within 3 weeks mean a harvest is possible. God is in control of everything, and our only remaining hope is prayer." So the congregation began to pray. They then walked out of the church and into the pleasant spring air. Meanwhile, somewhere up north in the Dakotas, a frigid air mass was descending from Canada. And what happened next would be observed by 500,000 people, and every single one of them would carry that memory forever. This is the account of April 14th, 1935, a day that would become known as Black Sunday, marking the single worst natural disaster in American agricultural history, and the day that forced 3.5 million people to abandon everything they had ever owned. But before we reach that point, we must rewind, because the events of Black Sunday didn't actually begin on April 14th. It all started 20 years earlier with a simple plow. The Great Plains of America had always been natural grassland. Vast expanses of native grasses. Their roots went 6 feet deep into the soil, firmly holding the earth in place through droughts that had brought down civilizations long before recorded time. Native American tribes, who had lived here for centuries, understood this perfectly. The grass was essentially the continent's foundation. Then the tractors arrived. Following World War I, wheat prices skyrocketed. The government urgently needed more grain. The American West was pushed to increase production. And during the 1920s, farmers across Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico did something the land had never been forced to endure before. They tore up all the native grass, every last bit of it. Using new gasoline tractors, machines powerful enough to rip through root systems that had been growing since before the Roman Empire even existed. Between 1925 and 1930, over 33 million acres of native grassland were plowed under on the southern plains, with 16 million of those acres in the Texas and Oklahoma panhandles alone. For a few years, it seemed to work. The wheat flourished. The money poured in. One Texas farmer, photographed by Dorothea Lange later on, recalled, "In 1927, I made $7,000. He was incredibly wealthy by the standards of that time. Then 1932 arrived. Hit the road. 5 simple words that defined an entire life. The rain stopped completely in 1931. It wasn't a sudden halt. It just ceased to fall. 1 season passed, then 2, then 3. The wheat withered and died, and the deep roots were gone. There was nothing left to hold the soil down, and the wind, the same wind that had always swept across the Great Plains, began to lift the very top layer of the continent and carry it away. By 1934, massive dust storms, called black blizzards, were raging across a territory as large as Pennsylvania, regularly turning the sky black from North Dakota all the way down to Texas. Each storm buried farmhouses up to their windowsills. Each storm claimed the lives of livestock. Each storm sent more families to the hospital with dust pneumonia, their lungs filling with fine particles until breathing became a struggle, then impossible. And through all of this hardship, most families chose to stay, because this was their land. Their grandfathers had originally tilled this earth. Their fathers had built these houses. You simply don't walk away from that kind of heritage. You seal the windows shut with tape. You stuff wet rags into the cracks around the doors. You pray, and you hold on, waiting for rain that never seems to come. On the morning of April 14th in the Oklahoma Panhandle, the atmosphere felt distinctly different. The air was truly calm. There was no dust in the air, no dull gray haze on the distant horizon, just a brilliant blue sky and comforting warmth. Marietta Foreman was just a child that day. She was riding in a car with her parents, driving through the Oklahoma Panhandle, that narrow strip of land in the far northwestern part of the state, the very core of the Dust Bowl region. Later, during an interview recorded in 2001 for Oklahoma State University's oral history program, she vividly recalled that specific morning. It was just so incredibly still, she remembered. By midday, people all across the region started noticing something appearing on the northern horizon. A faint, pale blue line of haze hugging the ground. Most people dismissed it as similar haze had appeared before, but by 2 in the afternoon, that line had grown significantly and continued to expand. Marietta Foreman, still in her parents' car, looked north. You could see it coming, but there was no wind, she recalled. Then she saw the birds. There were just thousands of them flying, just coming and coming and coming. Birds streaming rapidly south. Rabbits fleeing south. Every single living creature that could move was running in the exact same direction. And still no wind. At approximately 3 p.m., the leading edge of that cold air mass reached the southern high plains. What it was carrying was unlike anything anyone had ever witnessed before. Pauline Gray, who personally experienced the storm that day, later described it, saying it looked like a giant waterfall but in reverse. The top of the cloud was feathered and swirling, churning and tumbling, and whipping debris, like papers, sticks, and cardboard boxes, ahead of it. The wall of dust was an astounding 500 to 600 feet high, stretching 800 miles wide, and moving at a terrifying speed of 60 miles per hour. And the temperature, which had been a pleasant 80 degrees that morning, was already plummeting. In just a few hours, it would drop a dramatic 50 degrees. Marietta Foreman's family had to stop their car on the side of the road. They saw someone walking along the road, a young boy, all alone, pulling a wagon with 2 cows. They offered him a ride. And then, the immense wall of dust arrived. Utter blackness. It wasn't just like nighttime. Nighttime has different shades. You can get used to the dark at night. This was completely devoid of light. 13-year-old Harley Holiday from Dodge City, Kansas, had rushed outside to grab his family's laundry before the storm hit. The cloud just engulfed me outside with a load of clothes, he recalled later. I absolutely could not see a single thing. Static electricity, created by billions of dust particles rubbing against each other, was so intense it actually caused car engines to fail. Vehicles just stopped functioning right there on the road. Families were trapped inside, sealed in darkness. Some of them truly believed, with all their hearts, that this was the final judgment, that God had answered the prayers of Gaiman's Methodist church members. Not with rain, but with the end of everything. When the storm finally moved on, leaving total darkness for 40 minutes in certain areas, followed by 3 hours of dim light, people emerged into a world that had completely transformed. The sun eventually came back out, but people who were there said it had a strange purplish-green tint, like a bruise on the sky. And the dust, oh the dust, it was everywhere. It piled up against houses like snow, filled the seats of cars parked outside, buried fences, and covered livestock that hadn't reached shelter. More than 350 homes in the entire region had to be demolished after that single storm event. They were beyond repair. Millions of acres of newly planted wheat, the very wheat that represented the entire livelihood for tens of thousands of families. It was all gone. Rabbits were found dead along the roads. Birds lay dead in the fields. In Kansas alone, 20 people died from dust pneumonia and suffocation. And the topsoil, that precious topsoil that farmers had worked for decades to cultivate crops from, 300 million tons of it was swept away from the Great Plains on that one day. Yes, 300 million tons. Just vanished. An Associated Press reporter named Robert Geiger had been dispatched to the dust-covered areas for an assignment. He and his photographer, Harry Eisenhard, got caught in the storm about 6 miles north of Boise City, Oklahoma. They stayed put inside their vehicle for 2 hours. When the darkness finally lessened enough for them to drive, they made their way back to the town, and Geiger sat down and wrote a report. His editor in Kansas City, a gentleman named Edward Stanley, was working on rewriting the story, and somewhere during the process of turning Geiger's on-site notes into a polished article, Edward Stanley wrote 2 words: Dust Bowl. The following day, those 2 words were published in newspapers all across the nation. And for the very first time, the disaster that had been escalating for 5 years finally had a name that originated from a reporter stuck in a car in the dark in Oklahoma. Now, here's the question that had been weighing on every farm family across the southern plains for months. When will you leave? How much can you afford to lose before you decide to walk away? That question. I'm going to leave it right there, because that's where the true story actually starts. Not the dust storm itself, not the lack of rain, but the exact moment when a person stands in the middle of everything they've ever built and starts calculating whether it's still worth staying. This is part 1. Part 2 will follow those overloaded cars heading west on Route 66, towards California, towards a hope that they were never told was already shattered. If you want to be there when it arrives, please subscribe and activate notifications. And if this story moved you, if something here felt important to know, share it with someone who would appreciate it. History this detailed doesn't get shared by itself. We'll catch you in part 2.